Yes. Merry fifth day of Christmas.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to be starting our reading today in Revelation 7. So if you turn there, actually, we're going to start in Revelation 6, probably verse 12. We'll start there. A quick summary of last Thursday, if you can remember back there that far. We were talking about, we're still working through the Seven Seals big picture stuff. There's only one thing left on it, so if you don't have it with you, no biggie. It's only one more line. And last Thursday, we were on the part about the first six seals and the Olivet Discourse, and we had touched on that briefly maybe a week and a half ago. And then on Thursday, we talked about, we looked at it from the perspective of the Gospel of Luke. We looked at Luke 19 through 23 and how that showed not only a connection with the Olivet Discourse, or the Olivet Discourse in the first six seals, but also how the context of the Olivet Discourse and in the mounting opposition to Jesus from the Jewish leadership, and how from where we started reading in Luke 19, which is not the first place where it happens in Luke, but from there to all the way through chapter 23, what we have is Jesus presenting himself and his qualifications, and the rulers questioning him and starting to attack him and plot to kill him. And then he, in response to that, pronounces judgment and warning on them and on the city of Jerusalem. And so it goes on. And when we get to the Olivet Discourse, Luke 21, the first six seals are parallel with the first six ways that Jesus describes judgment coming. And so we have a kind of a pattern that's repeated in the Revelation from the Olivet Discourse. It's my thought that the Olivet Discourse is basically being repeated in the book of Revelation and expanded in the book of Revelation. And of particular note, I think, was the sixth seal, which we'll read again. But in Luke, you'll remember that Jesus, as he was being led to the cross, well, he was actually carrying the cross, but being led to the area of crucifixion, that the women were weeping. And he said, don't weep, over me, but weep for yourselves, because the day will come when the mountains, they'll say, let the mountains fall on us, because the day of God's wrath has come. And then this passage then is repeated in the book of Revelation, in the passage we'll read this morning. And that's really strong suggestion, I think, that the two passages are really about the same thing. It's about the coming judgment on Jerusalem in the first century as a result of the crucifixion of Christ. And as Jesus says in Luke, Matthew, and Mark, the refusal to listen to the prophets and apostles and the persecution of Christ's people after his death. So let's look at the sixth seal. We're going to read from that, and then I'll just read the whole thing, the sixth seal through Revelation 7:17. So starting in Revelation 6:12. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth, as late figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded like a scroll rolling up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and every slave and every free man, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who could stand? Chapter 6 ends with this question. Of course, when the book was written, there were no chapter divisions. Chapter divisions were put in later. I think they were 16th century, 15th or 16th century, the chapter divisions were added. But as we have it today, chapter 6 ends with this question. The day of the wrath of the Lamb and of God has come, and who can stand? And that question is actually answered in the very next chapter. It's the 144,000 and great multitude who can stand. So we'll go ahead and read that. After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree. So wind here is being used, you'll see as we continue to read, it says the angels are holding back the wind. And the wind here is being used as a picture of God's coming judgment. So they're holding them back so that the wind can't harm anything until something else takes place. And the something else is going to be the sealing of the 144,000. Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000. From the tribe of Asher, 12,000. From the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000. From the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000. From the tribe of Simeon, 12,000. From the tribe of Levi, 12,000. From the tribe of Issachar, 12,000. From the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000. From the tribe of Joseph, 12,000. From the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." All the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the 4 living creatures, and they fell down on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen. Then one of the elders asked me, "These in white robes, who are they and where did they come from?" I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tent over them. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Amen. Great, great reading. So 144,000, we've come to this chapter 7, which is the 144,000 is an issue that there has been much debate about. And who are these people, and what time period is this, and what's the relationship between the 144,000 and the great multitude? Is it the same group seen under 2 pictures? Is it 2 groups related in some way? Is, lots of different questions. The first thing I want to say is that, the way a person answers these questions has a lot to do with their own eschatology, their own way of understanding the book of Revelation is overall, would inform them here. Dispensationalists have a way of understanding it. They're futurists have a way of understanding it, which is different than, say, a preterist or a historicist. A futurist would look at the passage here and say that this is happening sometime in our future still, sometime in our future. Whereas a preterist or a historicist would look at the passage and say, this has already happened, it's in our past. It was in the future of the writer, John, but it's in our past now. And then there are other ways of interpreting it that would say the 144,000 is in our past, but the great multitude is in our future. So we have, again, all the ways you could interpret it, they have been interpreted that way. So I know that brings a cheer and certainty to everybody about how to understand this. But I have some suggestions on that. So first we'll look at the 144,000. Now they're mentioned again in Revelation 14. So let's go look at that. Revelation 14, verse 1 through 5. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. So that would be the seal of God, his name and the Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they kept themselves pure. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among men and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. A couple of months ago, we read this passage, and I noted that they have not defiled themselves with women, they're virgins, they're pure. That this is a reference, I think, to 1 Samuel 21, where David goes to the priest, and David has some of his men with him, and he's on the run from Saul, and he goes to the priest at Nob, and the priest, David's looking for food, and the priest only has the showbread, which is sacred and it's supposed to be given to the Levites, the priests and the Levites. But the priest concedes that it's an emergency and that he's supposed to be a agent of mercy, and he says to David, I have just this bread, but are your men pure? Have they kept themselves from women? And David says, yes, they have. This is the men's bodies are holy, even if the mission they're on is not. And what he was saying there is that as a part of the ritual before battle, men would not sleep with their wives to remain dedicated to the pure and dedicated, set apart to the battle, set apart to the mission. And so when this language comes up again in Revelation 14 about the 144,000, it has the connotation of just a military enterprise, a military unit. And so that becomes then associated by this text to the 144,000, some kind of a military motif there. The other thing in this passage in Revelation 14, verse 4, that I want you to note. So they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. That's good. That's Christians. Christians follow the Lamb. And they were purchased from among men and offered as firstfruits to God the Lamb. The vision in chapter 14 takes place on Mount Zion, I believe the heavenly Mount Zion. I believe this group is the ones who, they're with the Lamb he's on his throne, and they're with the Lamb in a place where there's no more weeping and all of that. So this would be similar to the great multitude. But the interesting thing I want you to notice is that they're offered as first fruits to God and the Lamb. Now, in some interpretations, the 144,000 are yet in our future. But the first fruits is a term that is applied only to the first fruits, not the last fruits. That would make sense. And the first fruits are those who are in the, obviously, maybe not obviously, but they're the Christians in the first century. I think we might actually have that in James. Let's see. Am I right about that? Maybe it's Peter. He made us a kind of first fruits. I think Peter says that. Let's look. 2 Peter. Sorry about this. I should have had this better than relying on my memory. Should have had it in my head. Let's see here. It's a race. Who can find it first? Sounds like somebody has potato chips.
Must be me, and I don't know how to turn off my sound on this little thing.
Ah,
Turn me off.
Sorry, it's James 1:18. So I was right the first time. Just couldn't find it. James 1:18. James writing to scattered Christians, probably mostly of Jewish origin. We think that because we know that the letter of James is really early. It's probably the first of all of the New Testament letters that we have. James was the pastor of the church in Jerusalem, and there was persecution rising, and a lot of his congregation fled Jerusalem, and it's thought that he was writing to them. And so he says, he calls them, actually James 1:1, it's interesting, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. That's interesting in light of Revelation 7, 12,000 from this tribe, etc. And then in verse 18, he says, he chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. So Revelation 14, when it calls the 144,000 the first fruits of God, that means early, not late. That would seem to probably rule out a group of people in our future, unless you could have two first fruits, which would be like having two almighties or something like that. So I think that a futurist interpretation is less probable because of them being called first fruits there. So who are yeah.
are you saying then that these 144,000 are like they were the soldiers, that they were soldiers or something? Or
I'm saying that the idea of military from the haven't defiled themselves is something to keep in mind as we consider the identity of the 144,000. I think at the end of it, we'll have figured it out. At least we'll have come to something that makes some sense.
Yeah.
And whether or not we all conclude that that's what it is obviously an open question. But so I want to look at, there were a couple of passages I listed on the bottom of that outline I referred to already, and we'll look at those passages in a little bit. They're from Numbers. But I want to look at this outline that I handed out earlier, sent you guys. It's I can't read it backwards, but it's something about the
healing of God's people.
Healing
the
of God's
sealing.
people in the mark of the beast.
That's the one. Okay. So if you happen to have that, and there's a quote there at the top of it that I can put in the chat.
Oh, here it is.
Let's see. I think again, I apologize for not being as organized as sometimes. I'd like to put this in the chat in case there are people that.
Are you talking about where he says these 12 tribes do not represent actual Israel?
Yeah, no, there you go. You're giving away the punchline. Yeah, that's the one. So most of you have it, but I think Stephanie, you don't have an outline today, right?
I don't have one that I can write notes on. I have the ones that you emailed, but I can't print it.
You can't pursue. You can look at it, so you have it there in front of you. Okay.
Yeah.
Then
but I don't have my Bible, so I'm using my phone.
Okay, that'll work. All right, so let's look at this quote, and then we'll look at the tribe list that he's listed, and I'll make some comments about these things and other related things. So the identity of the 144,000. Before I read the quote, I'll just state the reason for it. The list in Revelation 7 of the tribes, there's 12 tribes listed there. 12 times 12, 144, 144,000. 12 tribes listed there. And it turns out that there's close to 30 or 35 tribe listings in the Old Testament, and none of them look like that. And in fact, there's certain features of this particular tribe list that make it probably impossible that it could be an actual list of actual Jewish tribes. And I'll explain that in a minute.
In Revelation, you mean? In
Yeah,
Revelation 7.
Yeah, in Revelation 7. Now, of the 30 or 35 listings in the Old Testament, they're not all identical, but they generally have the same 12 names, just not in the same order. In some of the lists, you have Joseph, but not Manasseh and Ephraim. Does anybody know why? Why would you have Joseph and not Manasseh and Ephraim? Okay, so who were Manasseh and Ephraim's? They were brothers. Who is their father?
Joseph.
Joseph was their father. And at the end of Genesis, Jacob blesses Manasseh and Ephraim. And in future lists of the tribes, Joseph, who formerly, obviously he's one of the 12 sons, his tribe is split. So you have the half tribe of Manasseh and the half tribe of Ephraim. And so Joseph is not counted as a tribe. Ephraim, the half tribe, and Manasseh, the half tribe, are counted. So in some lists, you might get 13 names. Now, Levi is often in lists talking about the 12 brothers, but not very often in lists talking about the 12 tribes. Does anybody know why that might be?
Because he was a bad boy.
Levi, nope. Well, they were all bad boys, but Levi wasn't. That's not the reason. So we'll look at that. That's go to
The Levites.
yeah.
Levites were set apart.
Yeah, they were set apart, and there was a particular thing about the Levites. It was they didn't inherit any
The
land.
land.
They did not inherit any land. Okay, because the Lord was their inheritance. And in fact, if you looked at Numbers 35, you would see that all of the tribes were commanded by God to give cities to the Levites because the Levites had no land and they still needed to live someplace. So each of the 12 tribes gave them cities. I believe they had 48 cities plus 6 cities of refuge. And so the tribes gave them places to live because the Levites had no possession on an inheritance among the tribes. And the reason that they had no inheritance among the tribes, let's look at this because this is really interesting, is this is in Numbers 18, 20, and 23. Let's look at that, Numbers 18, 20, and 23. Numbers 18:20, then the Lord said to Aaron, you will have no inheritance in their land, nor will you have any share among them. I am your share and your inheritance among the Israelites. Verse 21, I give to the Levites, he's talking about what do the Levites get? I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work that they do while serving at the tent of meeting. From now on, the Israelites must not go near the tent of meeting, or they will bear the consequences of their sins and will die. It is the Levites who are to do the work of the tent of meeting and bear the responsibility for offenses against it. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. They will receive no inheritance among the Israelites. Instead, I give to the Israelites as their inheritance the tithes that the Israelites present as an offering to the Lord. That is why I said concerning them, they will have no inheritance among the Israelites. So they don't have any inheritance among the Israelites, and they will receive the tithes. But the reason they don't have any inheritance among the Israelites is because they bear the guilt of the sin of the Israelites. The Israelites cannot come and approach the tent of meeting. The Levites are there to keep them out, or else the Israelites will bear the responsibility for their own sin. That's what it says. But it goes on and says in verse 23, It is the Levites who are to do the work at the tent of meeting and bear the responsibility for offenses against it. This is the lasting ordinance for generations to come. They will receive no inheritance among the Israelites. So they don't get inheritance because they are taking sin. It's a picture. They are responsible for the sins of the Israelites, therefore they receive no inheritance. They receive nothing from God. And then he goes on and makes provision for them in the tithes and that thing. But the picture is of bearing the sin, bearing the responsibility for sin, and not receiving inheritance as a consequence of that. So the fact that they're included in Revelation 7, they're on that list if you didn't notice, has interesting implications for the accomplishment of redemption. As types and shadows, they bear sin for the people and receive no inheritance. But the actual reality has come and borne the sin. And now the Levites are relieved of their temporary responsibility and receive inheritance among God's people. That's the picture. That's a great picture.
You, Jesus.
Yeah, it's a really great picture. So let me read this quote from George Eldon Ladd, and I would recommend George Eldon Ladd as a wonderful commentator. He is historic premillennial, so he's a futurist, but not dispensationalist. And even though he and I would disagree on a great many of details of interpretation, he is very careful and very biblically knowledgeable. And if it was just a matter of disagreement between me and him, I would give up my view and say you're right, because I think he is a top-rate scholar. But I also have some conviction, I think, from the Holy Spirit, just as he does, about the view that I hold. But here's George Eldon Ladd. There are good reasons to believe that by the 144,000, John means to identify spiritual Israel, the church. This view is suggested by certain irregularities in the list of the 12 tribes of Israel. As a matter of fact, John's list agrees with no known list of the enumeration of the 12 tribes of Israel. Many interpreters insist that these 12 tribes must be interpreted literally and therefore designate literal Israel. However, when interpreted literally, these tribes do not represent actual Israel. A brief survey of several of the Old Testament listings will make this clear. So he lists only 3. His point is that the people who insist that these are actual Israelites and actual Israel are demanding that you have to interpret it literally. And he says, I am interpreting it literally. This is not Israel. And which is a really good argument. He's using the standard of the people who are saying that this is actually 12,000 from each tribe of Israel, Jewish men. And he's saying this is not Israel. Israel is never designated like this anywhere in the Bible. And so let me make just a couple of comments. So that's his point. Whether he's right about it's the church or not is, another question. But his point is, if you interpret it literally, this is not Israel. Let me point out 2 reasons why it's not. First of all, in Revelation 7, you'll notice that you have Joseph, second from the bottom, and you have Manasseh right in the middle. So that's 1.5 tribes. That's Joseph and one of his sons. Ephraim's not listed. That's kind of strange. Levi's on this list. Levi's not on any list of inheritance. Genesis 49 list is the list of the 12 sons. Ezekiel 48 list that he lists there is a list that dispensationalists are fond of quoting, which I think is why he goes to this list. This list is Ezekiel 48 is the list of the dispersion of the land given in the vision of the rebuilt temple, or of the Ezekiel's temple, not the rebuilt temple, but Ezekiel's temple, and the division of the land. And dispensationalists tend to think that this is a literal temple and that these are literal divisions of the land, which will happen in the millennium.
Our future.
Yeah, our future. according to the Ezekiel passage, right? So they're looking at the Ezekiel passage. So Levi's not on that list. You know, Joseph isn't on that list. Ephraim and Manasseh are on that list. So another difference is that in Revelation 7, while Levi is included, the tribe of Dan is not. And you can see on the
Right.
Ezekiel list and the Genesis list, the tribe of Dan is included. And in fact, the tribe of Dan is included on pretty much all of the lists in the Old Testament. I don't believe there's any list in the Old Testament that lacks Dan except this one in Revelation 7. Now, the explanation for Dan not being on the list, and I'm sure this is what I understand from my reading and listening to dispensational teaching and watching it on YouTube, but mostly my reading, is that Dan is thought to have been the first tribe to apostatize. They built a second place of worship in Judges 18, I think it is. And Judges 18:30. And that's usually the place where people go and say, this is why Dan is excluded, because they apostatized and they were the first one to do it. And let's look at the passage. So it's Judges 18:30. And this is not on the outline, so you might want to write it down. In fact, I think I probably said a couple things that weren't on the outline already. Judges 18. So this is near the end of the book of Judges. Judges has 21 chapters, and it goes through, a lot of judges and the cycles of the judges. And then at the end of the book, it goes through 3 or 4 episodes that are kind of typical of what was happening at that time, and it's not tied to a particular judge. So this is one of those episodes. Judges 18, 27, we'll start there. So there's a guy that's going to be referred to. His name is Micah. Now, Micah was, I think he was a Levite. Let's see. Anyway, he had been hired as a priest for a particular person, and he had built a shrine. And verse 27, then they took what Micah had made in his priest and went on to Laish against a peaceful and unsuspecting people. They attacked them with the sword and burned down their city. There was no one to rescue them because they lived a long way from Sidon and had no relationship with anyone else. The city was in a valley near Beth Rehob. The Danites rebuilt the city and settled there. So the Danites are the people of Dan. They named it Dan after their forefather Dan, who was born to Israel, though the city used to be called Laish. There the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time came of the captivity of the land. They continued to use the idols Micah had made all the time the house of God was at Shiloh. So this passage has gone to and said, here's basis for Dan's exclusion from the tribe list in Revelation 7. Dan was the first tribe to apostatize. As far as I can tell, there's other passages historically, chronologically, that are after this that are gone to, but this is the earliest one. So this would be the first place that Dan is said to apostatize. And I just want to suggest that that's not accurate. And I'll show you just an easy one reason why is if you go to Judges 2. So the book of Judges, you'll remember, is about the period of the judges. And in that period of judges, there was a cycle that the people of Israel continued to go through. And in Judges 2, that cycle is described. Let's see what's happening here. Judges
I'm sorry,
2,
where are we now?
Judges 2:6. 2:6. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. People served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gosh. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Verse 11, then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's command. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. The Lord had allowed these nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. The 5 rulers of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites lived in the Lebanon mountains from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamath. They were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands, which he had given their forefathers through Moses. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. This is the introduction to the book of Judges. This is the explanation of the cycle of judgment and crying out to God, and God's raising up a deliverer, and then again the cycle of apostasy, judgment, crying out to God, deliverance, apostasy, judgment. Dan is not the first to apostatize. Dan's example at the end of the book is to show how bad things were at the end of the period of the Judges. The book of Judges is really about the Canaanization of the Israelites. Under Joshua, they served the Lord. Joshua brings them into the land of Canaan. They make great conquests. You divide up the land. They all get their inheritance. And then they're told, don't intermarry, don't worship their gods. And yet this is the summary of what they did. They intermarried, they worshiped their gods, and they continued to go back to it. And it said in verse 19 that every time they fell further than their fathers. So we have a downward spiral. And at the end of it, they look just like Canaan. They look just like the Canaanites at the end of it. The episode with Dan at the end in Judges 18 is just that. It's at the end. The reason for all of the cycles of judgment is because the people apostatized repeatedly, not just Dan, all of them. And we could easily go back. How many of the tribes worship the golden calf?
All
All of them. Right. You're going to be not able to go back and prove that one tribe was worse than another. It's just not possible. So I don't think that that reason, which the people that hold that reason are, it's the dispensationalists, and the more careful writers among them say that this is a guess. It's speculation that Dan was the first to apostatize, and that's why he's not included. But I would say, yeah, it's a guess because there's certainly no evidence for that. But there's no reason given why Dan is excluded. There's no reason given why Levi is in the list. There's no reason why Ephraim is there or is not there while Manasseh is. There's no reason why is Joseph listed along with Manasseh. And there's several reasons why this is not a list of Israel. So it doesn't fit any of the lists. It's not a list of the 12 brothers. It's not a list of the tribes that inherit. It's not any of those lists. So then George Eldon Ladd makes the suggestion that it's not meant to be interpreted literally. It's meant to be understood symbolically, spiritually, if you will, that it's not a picture of actual 12 tribes of Israel, but that it's a picture of the church. That's Ladd's view. Now, some people would say this is a picture of actual 1,400 or 144,000 Jewish people whom the Lord has saved or who have become saved. If you're a dispensationalist and this is a future thing, then they're saved by obedience to the Mosaic law and not by faith. So you can't really say the Lord saved them, but they are saved. And on the dispensational view, it's 144,000 Jewish evangelists, and that the great multitude, which is saved out of all other nations, is the fruit of their evangelism. But again, that is, puts the passage in our future, which the idea of describing them as first fruits would seem to mitigate against. So for those,
Well, I can
yeah.
see reasoning to say that this does not represent the actual actual Israel, but where is the bridge to say that it actually represents the church?
Okay, right. So I think it's like this. I think the bridge goes this way. When we look at, so if it's not, we'll say it like this: if it's not representing actual Israel, then it's a symbol. That would be true. We'll think of this. Jesus is described in Revelation 5 as a lion and also as a lamb, but those are symbols. Jesus is not a lion or a lamb. And in the book of Revelation, it's pretty much a book of symbols. As we go through it, we look at the visions and we see pictures of things which are referring us to Old Testament passages, which are then seen to be symbolic and not actual. This is that, but this is a picture of that. So the thought then would be that when you get to Revelation 7 and its vision, that you would interpret it the way that you interpreted other visions. And since this is not a literal list, then it must be a non-literal list, a figurative list, which would be then a symbolic list. And so the thought would then be, you could say it like this: it's not a physical reality, therefore it's a spiritual reality. Those are the two categories. And what is the spiritual description of God's people? Well, they're called Israel. God's people are called Israel. And so they're called Israel in the Old Testament. They're called Israel in the New Testament. And and what is another thing that we call God's people? We call God's people the church. It's synonymous. And so that's how you would get to that. Now, whether or not it's the church of all ages or the first century church, the first fruits, then that's another question that has to be addressed. I think based on Revelation 14, that this is an early it's a first century group of Christians, 144,000, and that So then the question becomes, why 144,000? Why 12,000 exactly from each tribe? Now, God certainly could do that. God certainly could do 12,000 from here, 12,000 from there, 12,000 from there. There's no question about that. But when you're looking at visionary language, visionary writing, and in the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel, numbers are often, in fact, the default on interpretation is that the numbers are representing something else. And we know that 12 is very important in the Bible. And we know that 10 is very important in the Bible, and we've come across it several times in the Revelation. And we know that squares of numbers like 10 and 12, 144 and 100 are used, and what they basically connote, I guess, would be that the perfection or the fullness of that, of what's being spoken of. So 100 are, sometimes even cubed numbers are used, like 10 cubed is 1,000. So 1,000 is a perfectly full time. And that's the way, when we get to the millennial chapter, that's the way a lot of people interpret it. It's a long time in which God's purposes are fully accomplished. So 1,000, 10 cubed times 144, which is 12 squared. So you have 12, the number of the tribes of Israel. And in the New Testament, what do we have 12 of? We have 12
Well, Jacob had
apostles.
12. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament, Jacob had 12 sons. 12 is all through the Bible.
Yeah, 12 is all through the Bible. And its primary references in the Bible are the people of God in both testaments, the apostles and the churches they founded, and the people who are associated with the teaching of the apostles. The apostles, 12 becomes the 12, right? The 12. You don't even have to name them. And in the Old Testament, the tribes of Israel are often just called the 12 or the 12 tribes. They're not enumerated. They're just referred to that way. And when people say the sons of Jacob, everybody knows there's 12 tribes, even though the tribe lists are not exactly who the sons are. The tribe lists contain 2 grandchildren, and 2 of the sons are left out. So, so 12 becomes the number then associated with completeness in God's purpose. And of course, when it's squared or cubed, it becomes, the idea is the entire number of God's people, the perfect number. But I don't want to base anything really on numerology. But what I do want to point out is that numbers in the Revelation are used symbolically, just as numbers in the Bible often are used symbolically. Or if they're used literally, they also have a symbolic meaning, which is picked up by later biblical texts. So the options, Don, on for George Eldon Ladd, and maybe there are a couple more options available, but for Ladd, his options, as he saw it, were 144,000 Jewish men who had never slept with women, which is what the dispensationalists were saying, and something else. And by looking at it, he said, this isn't a list of the tribes. And so he said, these are not Jewish. So he went there, and that may have been the mistake where he goes, they're not Jewish, but he does get away from a list of a recognizable list of the tribes, or the tribes listed in a way that's recognizable. I guess I'd say it like that. It's interesting when you look at the list in Revelation 7 and you say, well, 12,000 from Manasseh, who's a son of Joseph, and 12,000 from Joseph. Was that only the people through Ephraim? And why not just call it Ephraim? I mean, the point is to produce a list. It has been produced here, which is impossible to refer to an actual tribe list. And that's the point that Ladd is making. So he says, basically, he goes from, if it's not representing actual Israel, then it must represent Israel some other way. And the other way the most likely other way then would be spiritual. And we equate that with the church, or at least with Christians, first century and beyond. And I think because first fruits, we're talking about a first century application, because we're talking about first fruits, but that's for everybody to decide on that. Let me look at the time. I'm thinking we're almost done. Yeah, it's 10:29. Obviously, I don't have time to talk about everything on the outline. Does anybody have a question or comment at the end here before we wrap up?
When you talk about
Well,
symbolic things, for example, the sixth seal, dispensationalists think that these things will happen literally, correct?
Yes.
In our future.
That's their default interpretation, right? Literal, right? The sixth seal is a case of really difficult literal interpretation, because all the islands disappeared and the sky receded like a scroll and all of that stuff, and then the kings, hide in the caves after everything's been destroyed. I mean, it actually says then the kings. So that's a bit difficult to interpret strictly literally, but yeah. Shirley, you were going to say something?
oh, yeah, and I always heard concerning the number 12. Well, first of all, I heard it's like almost 200 times in the Bible it's mentioned, and like 22 times in Revelation. I've never counted them.
Mhm.
But that it also symbolized God's power and authority,
Mhm.
and that it can symbolize the completeness of the nation of Israel as a whole, kind of thing, which you sort of mentioned that part anyway. But that it actually symbolized God's power and authority. I kind of thought, that was interesting that I had learned in the past about it. Not that it's true or not, but that's what I've always heard.
Yeah, so I can't remember all of the references, but I think that 12 is used in texts that are about God's power and authority, and so it becomes associated with that, just like it's associated with the 12 tribes and 12 disciples and
Mhm.
working out of God's plan and all of that. So you do have this cloud of associations with 12 and with other numbers, which should inform your interpretation, but shouldn't determine it. I mean, I think that you should have some knowledge of what's being, maybe in the Hebrew mind, the association with numbers was more significant than it is in ours. I'm not sure about that, but I know to most of us, when we start talking about this number means this or may mean that we all get uneasy. I don't like it. Personally, I don't, so I don't put a whole lot on it. I just say this is a number that's used this way, and so we can't rule out that here it's being used that way. In addition, it's in an apocalyptic visionary text, where pretty much everything in an apocalyptic visionary text is a symbol and is figurative, and so therefore, why would the numbers be excluded from that? I mean, Jesus is a lamb with 7 eyes. So we have to take into account the type of literature, and obviously 12 in Genesis, when it says Jacob had 12 sons, that is not symbolic. Okay, but this is theological, historical, narrative genre, whereas now I'm looking at here apocalyptic visionary, so it's a little bit different. It's like the difference between the way poetry might use trees and the way you might read about trees in a historical narrative. In poetry, trees clap their hands. So we.
As it looks like it.
Yeah,
When the wind's blowing.
It looks like it, sounds like it. Or trees have, some other association. So yeah, we interpret things according to the type of literature. That's one of the things that's foundational, and there are, I guess I'll finish here. We don't want to go too much longer because it's 10:33, but So the starting point, there are two starting points, and then there's starting points everywhere between them. So when we read the Revelation or the Apocalypse, when we read the apocalyptic visions in the Revelation, the question is, how should we approach this? And the answers have been, on the dispensationalist side, have been, we take this literally unless absurd. Okay, that is actually a quote from several leading dispensationalists have said that, literally unless it's absurd to take it literally. Jesus obviously is not alone, obviously. So, and I can imagine 144,000 Jewish men. If I can imagine 144,000 Jewish men, it's not absurd. Okay, so literally unless absurd. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the default for apocalyptic literature is similar to the default for poetry. We presume a high degree of figurative language. We start reading and we presume figurative, unless there's a really good reason for taking it non-figurative. So it's pretty much the opposite of the dispensational principle. And then everybody is, kind of scattered. Everybody's personal reading is scattered somewhere on that continuum, which would encompass every possible way you could read it. But everybody has a default when you approach apocalyptic visionary literature. I have a default when I approach poetry. Let's talk about that. We all know poetry. My default in poetry is this is probably going to contain lots of figurative language, lots of emotive pictures, right? That the point isn't what the literal poem says. The point is what is being evoked, right? And so that's my approach to poetry. I think we all approach poetry in a way similar to that. We don't read poetry for a literal description. It's a different type of genre. So apocalyptic, so if you have history, poetry, apocalyptic's going to be further over this way. It's going to be further toward the almost entirely figurative spectrum. And so my default when reading apocalyptic visions is to say, they're figures. It's a figure. It's a picture. It's a symbol. It's unless there's a really good reason not to take it as a symbol. And the fact that I can understand, that I could picture in my head 144,000 Jewish men is not a good reason to take this as literal in my view, because I can also picture a dragon with 10 heads. I can picture that. Can you picture a dragon with 10 heads? I can.
You've been watching too many horror movies.
Right. There's no reason to take that literal just because you can picture it.
Right.
Well, I think the person, it was best said concerning the book of Revelation, said that to be taken symbolically unless it's literal.
Unless it's literal, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a good rule. Well, I think it is a good rule to presume the presence of the majority presence of figurative language. I think that is a good rule. And that's the way we've been approaching it. When we go to the Old Testament and we say, see, these things are associated with this, what we've done is we have said it's a symbol. So, all right, well, we'll get through the 144,000 and the mark of the beast and the sealing maybe on Thursday, or maybe we'll just get a little bit into that. So those are the tribe lists. You can go through your Bible and look at all the lists. Just search for, a couple of the names together, and you'll start finding the lists. Or you can probably even go online and look for where are all the tribes listed in the Bible, and you'll get a list. And you can compare them if you want. So let's end.